Hi, my name is Maia Fleischman. I'm with Alabama Disabilities Advocacy Program. I am a voting rights fellow, which means I am an attorney who focuses on the intersectionality between disability rights and voting rights.
So tell us more about, are you originally from Alabama?
I am not. I actually just moved to Birmingham in July. I am originally not from Florida, but I've been living in Florida for the majority of the past 20 years, South Florida to be specific. So I just moved from Miami to Birmingham, Alabama in July. So I am fairly new.
Oh, well, congratulations on being here. And I always like to ask, what is your college football team?
I am not a huge football person, but I guess it would be the Gators. I hope that's okay. I went to University of Florida for undergrad. And that I think is the only football games I've ever attended. So it would have to say, go Gators.
Yeah, you might get criticized for that here in the state, but stand strong on that.
I'm truly not married to any football team, so I'm willing to be persuaded.
Yeah, I guess you got to go to a home game in Tuscaloosa and at Auburn and kind of feel it out.
Yeah, I'd love to. Once it's safe, I would love to do that.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about ADAP and exactly what your role is there.
Sure. So ADAP is every state has a PNA and they're federally funded. My role is more independent since I'm there on a grant, and my job is really exploring voting rights issues as they come up, any challenges or barriers that may come up for folks with disabilities. So especially for this election, as you know, we've had an active role in the People First v. Merrill case that was filed here in Birmingham, Alabama, or the Northern District of Alabama, I should say, as well as just being the person on the ground at a point of contact for people who may face any barriers voting.
Now we're going to get into the People First versus Merrill. Is there anything else that pops into your mind that you've seen on the ground that are limitations in voting for some people?
Sure. What comes to mind, there are quite a few issues, unfortunately, but what comes to mind right now is the inaccessible absentee ballots for folks who are vision impaired or blind. So far, there has been a few issues with the auto marks machines at the absentee election manager's office where people can do what's known as absentee in-person voting. So there's been a few issues that I'm aware of with that. And then, of course, Alabama does not have accessible absentee ballots. They also don't have early in-person voting. So there's quite a few issues that affect the people with disabilities.
Why do you think that Alabama doesn't have some of those things when other states do? I've heard that about 17 other states do either curbside voting or extended in-person voting.
Yeah, so I actually think for curbside voting, prior to the pandemic, 29 states actually have curbside voting, whether that be throughout the states or whether that means they have counties that offer it. As well as in person, I don't know how many states have in-person voting. I come from Florida, as I said, and early in person, and we do have early voting. I've always early voted in Florida because the lines are, not long at all. I'm usually in and out within 10 minutes. Why Alabama doesn't have those? I think Alabama has a history of voter suppression, and I believe that I believe that it is more challenging to vote here, whether that be in person or absentee, and that's just the reality.
Let's talk a little bit about that voter suppression. What is voter suppression?
I'm sorry, like the definition of voter suppression?
Yeah, so somebody might hear it as a buzzword. Yeah, it's kind of a concept thing there.
Okay, so I would say that voter suppression is really, I would say it's a more focused method of of having barriers for people to for having barriers in place for people to vote, and that disproportionately falls upon people of color, people who are from poor areas, and also people with disabilities. So I would say it's the barrier to voting purposefully.
Hmm. And once again, when we had that conversation with Merrill, he was quick to point that out. Some of his colleagues will say, "Why does Alabama have voter suppression?" I don't know if there was a clear-cut answer there that he gave. I didn't feel like there was, but he kind of, talked about some of the things that he's trying to do. But do you feel like, in general, we haven't made much ground compared to other states?
Yeah, I mean, what I heard, voter suppression really is like a strategic way to ensure that some or specific groups can't vote, right? So I think by making it harder for folks to vote, we are suppressing their right to vote. So, I mean, compared to other states, we have much more restrictive laws. I heard you all talk about universal absentee voting. And I would say states like that, which I believe there's 6 states right now that have that, just try to make it easier for folks to vote. And that doesn't necessarily equate to more fraudulent voting, which is a lot of the response that we get, especially in Alabama, is, everyone's quick to say the easier our voting is, the more fraudulent actions will occur, which I don't think is correct. And as we talk about people first later, I think that there was, in our 2-week trial, we produced a lot of evidence that demonstrates that a lot of these restrictions aren't really related to voter fraud or preventing voter fraud, I should say. So why Alabama makes it harder for people to vote, I can only really speculate and say that that's purposeful. When we have more onerous barriers to voting, less people are going to vote.
How do we try and make our voice heard so that some of these things will start to change in the future?
That's a really good question. I think that there's a lot of advocacy that we can do on the ground. I've only been in Alabama 3 or 4 months, and I've already been in touch with a lot of groups who are doing, the groundwork. If people want to get involved for this election, I know I'm kind of jumping a little ahead of myself, but ADOP specifically, we're doing poll monitoring surveys to kind of see how accessible polling sites are, on November 3rd. So if you want to get involved, I would definitely check out our Facebook page. We have, I think, Twitter and Instagram as well. And that's just like an easy way to get involved and monitor poll sites to see which are actually accessible. I think that there's a lot of legislative action that can be done in the state, and as well as just on the ground footwork, raising awareness.
So if someone's interested in getting involved in that, they still have time to get involved at the poll stations.
Absolutely. Yeah, they can volunteer as poll workers, I believe. And also, if you're going to vote and if you're planning on voting in person on November 3rd, please get in touch, go to our social media, go to our website. And, it's really easy to just complete one of these surveys as you are going into the polling sites.
Now, I want to take a step back.
And also report any issues that you may face while voting. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but there's a lot of rights that people have at the polls, and people may not know that. So if there are any barriers that people who do know their rights may face on Tuesday, please report it to us. And that's very helpful. And that's a great way that people can be, activists.
Yeah, heck yeah. Kind of community, I don't want to say policing there, but community helping.
Yeah, totally.
Now, I feel like there's another buzzword when we talk about having extended in-person voting or mail-in voting. A lot of people jump to voter fraud. And I was doing some reading, and it seems like maybe there were 2 cases in the state of Alabama in the last how many years that actually happened. So it was like, we talk about, it sounds like there could be thousands of that happening every day, that there is mail-in voting or curbside voting, but the stats actually don't prove that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We just had a 2-week trial for People First back in September. And really the government's position was that when we're talking about absentee voting, at least we're not really focusing on curbside voting right now, but absentee voting, which requires, for the audience that may not know, you need a 2-witness signature requirement for the ballot or a notary. So that means that when you're turning in your ballot, you need 2 people to watch you sign your ballot, 2 adults, 2 people over 18, over 17. In addition, when you are, prior to even getting the ballot, right, you need to submit an application that says, I want an absentee ballot, and you need to submit your photo ID with that application. So focusing on those 2 requirements, really the government's position is that those 2 requirements are necessary to prevent voter fraud. So in our case, we were asking to waive those requirements in light of the pandemic. When we're thinking about people with disabilities, getting a photo ID, first of all, not every household has internet, not every household has a computer or a copy or a printer, a copier or a printer. I know that if I wasn't working from home right now, I would not have a printer in my house. I have not had a printer in my house since the 90s. So, you're asking people to go out, go to Kinko's, go to their local library and expose themselves in order to get those photo IDs. Second, a lot of adults live by themselves or with people that are not over the age of 18 and can witness their ballot. So you're also asking people to further expose themselves or go to a notary and possibly pay anywhere from $5 or higher. So the government's position, of course, is that those things are intact to prevent voter fraud. However, throughout the 2-week trial, we had many witnesses. Some witnesses were from the defendants talking about the cases of voter fraud that have occurred in Alabama. And ultimately, the judge in the 197-page order found that, for the witness requirement, that there was really no evidence that it prevents fraud. And for the photo ID requirement, that it's not, and he found it wasn't very clear whether or not it prevents fraud because there are other ways for an individual to verify their identity. For example, and then I'll stop, the absentee ballot asks for your driver's license number or the last 4 of your social. Also your signature. So with all those things in place, it's very easy to verify your identity. You don't need a photo ID copy.
Mm-hmm. And there were quite a few steps. I know this was a back and forth trial or case. Take us through kind of some of those steps, because I believe People First had prevailed in the first few sessions there.
Yeah, so this case actually started in May. We've been into the Supreme Court twice. We've been to the 11th Circuit twice, and then of course the District Court twice. And the first kind of set of motions through that was in regards to the primary in Alabama, which was in July after being postponed. It was originally supposed to be in March. Granted, I will say this was before I joined the case, since I did not join until end of July. But the District Court found for plaintiffs both times. The 11th Circuit found for plaintiffs the first time for the preliminary injunction, and then the Supreme Court, talking about the first time through, granted defendants stay, which means that, for folks who may not know, defendants requested a stay, which kind of means to just stop the District Court's order from being enforced. So the Supreme Court, they did not necessarily provide any reasoning or any explanation. They just granted the defendant's stay. Similarly, the second time around, the District Court found for us that the curbside ban was unconstitutional and was a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. It also found that the photo ID requirement was unconstitutional, and as well as the 2-witness requirement. The 11th Circuit granted the stay for both photo ID requirement and witness requirement, but denied the stay in curbside. So curbside was the issue that ultimately went to the Supreme Court this time around. And again, the Supreme Court did not have a majority reasoning. They just granted defendant stay. And Justice Sotomayor wrote a really powerful 5-page dissent on why curbside voting complies with the ADA is in a reasonable accommodation under the ADA for folks with disabilities. Sorry for my long-winded answer.
No, I think it's important. I don't know if a lot of people know about what's been happening there in the court system and curbside voting. I definitely hadn't heard of it until we were planning on doing a broadcast with Merrill, and I just don't know if most of the community is familiar with it. So I think I appreciate you going through that. You know, this isn't something that's just only been happening in the last couple of weeks. This is something that's been going on for months, and it's been a back and a forth. I can't understand why. I can understand why both sides are very passionate about it, but why or where is the next step to go with this?
As far as curbside voting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, ADAP is I'm very sorry to see that this will not be an option this election year, especially in light of COVID-19. I think I'm very worried about, I think Secretary Merrill may have mentioned this, but people in Alabama, you don't have to wear a mask to vote. You could have COVID-19 and you could go in and you could not be wearing a mask, I'm really sorry to say that people, given how difficult it is to vote absentee, given how confusing the absentee ballot is, a lot of people are going to be forced to either waive or give up their right to vote, or expose themselves, especially with people with medical conditions, and further expose themselves and put themselves in harm's way and in danger in order to exercise their right to vote. I do think that curbside voting is something that should be offered in Alabama, and it is a reasonable accommodation. I mean, the CDC, recommended it themselves for voting this year in light of COVID-19. And like I said at the beginning, 29 states had it implemented way before COVID-19. So, I think regardless of the pandemic, I think it is one of the best ways, and it's one of the only ways to truly accommodate folks with disabilities, so that they don't have to go inside the polling sites, and also, have a right to, if they need assistance from poll workers, it might be one of the best ways for them to vote as privately as they can, from the safety of their car.
Now, Secretary Merrill did state that he was pretty adamant about no curbside voting, and went as far to say, as long as he is Secretary of State, there will be no curbside voting. And it is my understanding that there is no law saying yes or no, but he is saying that he is going to make it law.
I don't think that anything can stop him from introducing that into the legislature, and hopefully we can kind of build some momentum and some advocacy that opposes that legislation if it were to be in place. But I guess we'll see. Right now I think the focus is on making sure, the reality is that on Tuesday, counties that did want to implement curbside voting, counties that were planning and had the infrastructure to vote curbside, won't be able to. So I think the most important thing right now is making sure that as many people can vote on Tuesday or earlier, and do it in a way that's safe. I will say that for folks out there who are watching, and if you live in Madison County, if you live in Mobile, Lee County, Wilcox, and I am missing one, Lowndes, I would definitely recommend calling your local AEM office, the absentee election manager, because they are offering some extended times. I know Madison, for example, is offering drive-through photo ID copying and witness requirement or notaries. I know Mobile Public Libraries are offering free curbside notaries. So things like that, I would definitely contact your local AEM office to see if there's any way you can avoid going in on Tuesday if you are nervous about exposing yourself, and see if there's a different way that you can do it a little more safely before November 3rd.
Well, I like how you brought that back around and say, you know, this is where we are right now. We can't do anything before Tuesday about curbside voting statewide. So let's focus on what we can do and make sure that everybody that is registered is going to vote. One thing that I brought up with Secretary Merrill is I have a grandmother and she is in her 80s, and it was mentioned that somebody over 70 would be able to kind of go to the front of the line. And the way the conversation with Secretary Merrill said there weren't accommodations for people with disabilities that would do that. Are there accommodations when you get there, if there is a long line, that you could go to the front of the line?
I am so happy you brought that up, because unfortunately that information was not correct. So the part that I'll read it. I pulled it up. So section 17-9-13 of the Election Code of Alabama states an election official shall allow any voter who is mobility disabled or over the age of 70 who so requests to move to the front of the line at the polling place. So if you are disabled, and again, I want to also say that by law, nobody can ask you what your disability is. Nobody can ask you why you need to have an assistant, and I'll talk about that other accommodation that's available. But yes, if you are disabled and you cannot stand for that long, please talk to your poll worker, tell them this, and say that you would like to be accommodated and go to the front of the line. If they say no, please call us. This is what we're here for. I will be by the phone on Tuesday if you have any issues receiving any accommodations. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, I had a couple people in chat when I went back. The comments were a little delayed, and I saw some people saying, no, that's not correct. So I wanted to bring that up today with you, just so that was clear.
Yeah. I also want to, when we're talking about accommodations of day of, I also want to say that Alabama election law 17-9-13, you can bring assistants to the polls. So as long as it's not your employer, an agent of the employer, or officers or agents of the union, of your voters union, you can also ask a poll worker for help. Again, if they say that you cannot, please call us.
Now, it may be a little, you know, sometimes going into a new situation can be a little stressful, and we don't often go to voting every day. You know, these are once, you know, the presidential is every 4 years, you know, governor and secretary and legislator. So it's not something we do every day. And when going into new situations, sometimes it can be cumbersome. How would you poll up and notify a poll worker? Are they wearing a special shirt, or would you just start asking, hey, are you a poll worker?
That's a really good point. I think just stopping to acknowledge for a second that voting is overwhelming. Seeing hundreds of people is overwhelming. Seeing people with masks and not being able to like kind of immediately identify necessarily if someone's working is overwhelming. Like just voting in a pandemic is overwhelming. All these things are overwhelming. I'm overwhelmed thinking about it. You know, this is why I don't think I voted on election day I honestly can't remember ever voting on election day. Like I said, I'm from Florida. We have really great early voting in comparison. So, you know, I think that there are some sort of markers to indicate who is volunteering and who is there to help. I don't want to make anything up because I don't know if they're wearing a shirt or anything to indicate. You know, I would just encourage to safely kind of ask anyone. And if they say, no, I'm not a poll worker, fine, move on. But I don't know. I'm assuming they are identifiable. But how, I don't know if it's a button or a shirt, you know, which also makes it harder for people who are vision impaired. And, you know, I think that there's a lot of ways that people don't see or recognize how voting, you know, doing like an act like parking your car and then going inside a polling place and waiting in line. I think a lot of us don't think about how that can be difficult for people with disabilities unless we ourselves have a disability or we know someone or care for someone, like you mentioned, your grandmother, you know, who do have disabilities and do have barriers that makes things like voting, which may be easier for some, harder.
Yeah, so I'm thinking I'm taking my grandmother to the polls on Tuesday, and I'm thinking, you know, I'm going to go and park, and then I'm going to walk up, and I don't know who to talk to, and I'm going to, I think a lot of people are going to be like, why the heck is he walking to the front of the line? You know, and I'm just looking for a poll worker to ask input for. But, you know, it'd be nice if they were right there when he walked up, and he had one person introducing themselves, I'm a poll worker, but I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, maybe. And I will say again, like, it really is none of anyone's business about whether or not, you know, why you may be cutting the front of the line or anything like that. Not all disabilities are automatically visible. And again, it's against the law to ask someone that what their disability is and why they need an accommodation.
And I want to kind of jump around here, but while we were talking about curbside voting and mail-in voting, a comment came up on Monday. You know, the big thing against curbside voting for Secretary of State Merrill was the break in the chain. So the ballot that you fill out would have to be given to somebody else and then entered into the system, basically. And someone made a comment that what's the difference between that and mail-in voting? Your ballot's got to be received by somebody and then put into the machine. Is that kind of similar there, or are those two different? Does that happen different?
You know, Alex, I read through some of the comments, and then I saw another comment from a poll worker who took offense to Secretary Merrill's statement. And I'll say this. I think it is kind of offensive to assume that poll workers are going to commit some sort of nefarious acts. Some of the voter fraud incidences that came up during our trial were of county clerk's offices having workers inside the county clerk's office who took absentee ballots and messed around with them. So I think that a poll worker could potentially do some sort of act to mess with the ballot. An absentee election manager could do it. Someone working in the office could do it. I mean, anytime the ballot is not, I guess, directly in front of you, it can happen. And I will say that I do think it's offensive to suggest that poll workers are untrustworthy. They do take an oath. And I think that poll workers who are willing to work during a pandemic in order to ensure that our system of democracy is upheld, I don't think that they should be slandered that way. You know, and I'm very grateful for people who are volunteering on Tuesday in order to help folks vote and to, you know, especially those who are accommodating folks with disabilities. So I don't agree with that. I think I agree with that in the sense that anybody who doesn't have the ballot in front of them, and that includes mail-in voting, can somehow alter a person's ballot.
Mm-hmm. Now, Monday, Secretary of State Merrill mentioned that even when these accommodations, some of these accommodations are made in other states, such as curbside voting or early voting, that they didn't see the number of voters increase with those. How do you feel about that statement? And I haven't seen any of the evidence.
Yeah, so I don't really know about that statement. I don't, maybe I'm missing something I don't fully understand, but I will say I did look up a few numbers. And I found that nearly 70 million people, about 70 million people have already voted, whether that's early voting or absentee voting. Specifically, more than 34 million have casted ballots absentee already. And then I read somewhere that that's about 50% of the total numbers of votes, like the total number of votes in general in 2016 election. So I don't really know about that exact statement that he made. I'm a little confused, and maybe I would like, you know, some further explanation of that. of what he meant by that with some evidence and data. But I do know that we have seen a lot more absentee ballots than in the past. And we have seen a lot of people go early vote more so than other elections, including 2016. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think one thing on his behalf that, he said he would look at the data moving forward, and he was open to some changes on a few things. The curbside voting wasn't one of them. But when we kind of hit on those things, he was, was agreeable to some changes in the future. And so I think that was, good on his part to acknowledge that, even though it seems like we can butt heads sometimes. Now, he did mention that 94% of Alabamians are registered to vote, but we don't get 94% of people that do vote. Why do you think that is? And that's just across the U.S. as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons. I will say I'm going to focus on Alabama because that's a system that I've, been exposed to and I know. I think there's a lot of reasons why maybe all 94% of that population isn't voting. I think that there's a lot of factors that we can think about. I will say, focusing, first of all, we don't have early voting. So that would mean you either vote absentee or you vote on November 3rd. And as we know, the polls are open 7 to 7. People have children, people have jobs that aren't going to give them time off to vote. People don't have transportation. There's a lot of reasons that people cannot show up to the polls on November 3rd. So for the absentee ballot, typically our absentee ballot, we have to fulfill something called the excuse requirement, which Secretary Merrill did waive this year in light of COVID-19. So typically for the excuse requirement, that means that you need a reason. You need to state a reason that you're voting absentee this year. Now, Secretary Merrill has waived that this year. However, Alex, if you look at the absentee ballot, you have to check off the second box under why you cannot go to the polls this year. And it does not state, I am fearful of coronavirus, and that is why I am not going to the poll. It says something else. So I've had people ask me, they're like, are you sure I checked number 2? I'm confused by the wording. It doesn't really seem to fit my case because I don't necessarily have a physical infirmity, or I'm not necessarily this age, but I'm nervous anyway about COVID. And Secretary Merrill has said, no, check that box. But I think the language is still confusing because the language still doesn't really reflect those changes. Second of all, I mean, in general, just having an excuse requirement, right? We also have a strict photo ID law that I think was enacted in 2011. And like I said, the absentee ballot requires your photo ID copy, as well as the witness requirement or a notary. So I think that there's a lot of reasons, there's a lot of barriers that make voting very onerous. It makes it overwhelming. Applications for the absentee ballots can be denied, which also brings me to my next point, that once you apply for an absentee ballot, you are taken off of the list for voting. So let's say I don't get my absentee ballot in time, I can't go on November 3rd to vote. That's it, I'm already taken off the poll list. So there's a lot of reasons. So there's a lot of challenges.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense. If you request an absentee ballot, you're taken off the poll list. So even if you don't get your ballot, you can't go in person to vote on the 3rd.
Your name's off the list. Yeah, your name's off the list.
So this was kind of a statement that Secretary Merrill mentioned, and I wanted to see what you thought about this. He said that poor planning on your part, and he was talking about voting. His thing was, you've had 2 months to do a mail-in ballot. And he followed that up with poor planning on your part doesn't constitute an emergency on others.
That statement makes me feel really sad. To be honest, that statement is really disappointing to hear. I guess I'll just talk about first overall what I think about that statement. I don't think anyone chooses to have a disability. I don't think people choose to have a mental health illness. I don't think people choose to be have vision impairment. I don't think people choose to be deaf. I think these are just circumstances that are a part of people's lives. It's not a person's fault necessarily that they have medical conditions or disabilities that make voting even harder in light of COVID-19 because it makes them more vulnerable for serious illness or even death. I don't think it's appropriate for a public official to suggest that people with disabilities have a higher burden of pre-planning in advance when other people who don't have medical health conditions or disabilities don't have to pre-plan necessarily, that they can just go in and out if they want. I think we should cherish people's right to vote, and that includes people with disabilities. I also want to add that I was thinking about this in times of COVID-19. I don't know about you, but I haven't been able to pre-plan anything. I haven't been able to pre-plan vacations. I haven't been able to pre-plan visit with my families or my friends. You know, I've had plans to, you know, maybe meet up with a couple of friends and practice social distancing, and then they tell me that they were exposed to COVID-19. Or I've had several friends and family members who have had COVID-19 and nobody planned to get it. In fact, these are people who were very, very cautious. So, you know, people are exposed to COVID-19 every day. I think a lot of responsible adults, if they were exposed to COVID-19, so let's say I was exposed to COVID-19 last week and I was planning on going to I had planned to go to my county courthouse to do in-person absentee ballots because I was nervous about using the postal system, which is very, very real. Okay, so let's say I had planned for October 26th to go. Okay, so, but then I was exposed last week. I'm a responsible adult and I'm quarantining for 14 days. I cannot go. I can't go on November 3rd because if 14 days won't pass. So, I mean, I think that I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as poor planning, but unfortunate circumstances because we're in the middle of an unprecedented pandemic. So yeah, I guess that wraps up how I feel about that statement.
No, it's a crazy thing. You know, this is the first time I've really experienced something like this, the COVID thing, the pandemic that's hit home for me in this way. And you just don't know what it is on the day to day. And that can wear on your psyche, your mental health, uncertainty there. You know, if you're working in an office and you get exposed to COVID and you got to quarantine for a couple of weeks, you know, that affects your pay, you know, all these things if you can work. So it's very stressful right now. And like I said, I haven't gotten out as much as I want to and, you know, go for a hike or something like that. But I'm a social being. I like to be around people. And I haven't really been able to do that much.
Yep, I am with you there. I am with you, unfortunately. So yeah, no, it's a very scary time. And I know a lot of people with disabilities also are like socially isolating in ways that I commend them. You know, when they're not even ever in contact with more than one adult at a time. And they can't even fulfill the witness requirement if they wanted to. So, you know, things like that maybe we're not considering, maybe Secretary of State is not considering. So I don't know. Mm-hmm.
I always like to ask, going through this process right now, getting people the opportunity to vote, making sure they do vote, what is something that you think we could do as a community, the disability community in Alabama, for the next vote? What have you seen during this process leading up to this vote? What could we do leading up to the next process to try and up those numbers for the number of participants voting? So is there anything that you've seen going in the past few months, like we should do this next time, this will help?
Yeah, well, and you mentioned this, a lot of states are having accessible absentee votes, kind of like the way that we do on the computer for folks who are abroad or military abroad and their families. I think that would be very helpful for people with disabilities. You know, again, I would love to see curbside voting implemented like other states have it. I would love to see early voting in place. I think that there's I think the good thing about having a lot of strict requirements to voting is that there's a lot that can be done to help get people to the polls moving forward. There's no shortage of activism required or needed.
Yeah, I think getting people excited about it too. Like right now, we're all really charged in the U.S. for this. I don't ever remember, I have family members that won't talk to each other over this presidential election. And that's crazy to me, but it's a very charged time right now. But after the election, it'll kind of die off there. And so we won't get charged again until the next election or vote that we have. So I think it's important to maintain that enthusiasm for voting.
Yeah, and I'll say this on a point that I can agree with Secretary of State is that, there's a lot of, if there are any issues that you all are facing this election, don't forget it and reach out to the Secretary of State and let him know. Let him know how voting has been difficult. Let him know what you want. Let him know what you would like to see changed. From my understanding is that he's very much for customer service, and he wants to hear from everyone. So shoot him an email. Let him know what you want.
Well, he gave out his personal cell on the broadcast, so
use it.
Let's send him some text messages.
Yeah, use it. Let him know. Let him know what you need.
Well, I just want to really drive home, voting on next Tuesday. And then if people are experiencing that they're not getting the accommodations, how would they best contact you?
Yeah, so I am pulling up. I don't have it. I don't know the number by heart. There we go. I can also drop it in the link, but if you contact our general line, I think also there's like an 800 number that I can also comment when you post the video. And I'm sorry that I don't have it up right now.
No, it's okay. Let's do it after. We can always comment in the chat. I think it's good to put links in there so people.
But definitely contact us if you're having any issues on Tuesday. Not only that, but if you're having any issues, here we go. 1-800-826-1675. Also, if you're having any issues at your local county clerk's office, please also call us and let us know if you need you're entitled to use an automark machine at your absentee. Your clerk's office. Also, you can take care of the application at that moment and then get an absentee ballot, so you don't have to go back and forth and cast your ballot at the clerk's office. I do want to say a couple of important dates. So tomorrow is the last day to cast your application. So meaning tomorrow is the last day to apply for your absentee ballot. So the last day, this is kind of confusing. So the last day to vote absentee is November 2nd. But if I go to my county clerk's office on November 2nd, I will not get an application. I already have to have the ballot. So, definitely get to that, get the application. At this point, I would not suggest sending anything through the mail. If you can, please drop it off at a ballot drop box or at your clerk's office. Again, Alex, this is not easy for folks, in rural communities, not easier for people who maybe don't have transportation. This is not easy for people who cannot drive themselves and need to somehow get a ride. But, if you're able to make it work, I highly encourage it. Yeah.
It's important that you do what you can within the realms of being safe to get your vote out.
Mm-hmm.
That's important.
Yeah.
So are there any other things that we haven't talked about that you think are important for the community to hear?
I just want to reiterate, if you are voting on November 3rd and in person, and you would like to fill out a polling survey, to make sure that your voting location is accessible, please look at our social media, Alabama Disabilities Advocacy Program, and fill up that survey. That is very, very useful for us. Like Secretary Merrill said, you know, from every election, we're gathering information and we're learning, you know, and, you know, I just want to say again, how disappointed we were with the People First v. Merrill outcome. You know, a lot of these barriers are incredibly onerous, and it's difficult for folks to navigate the system of voting. And I hope one day we can make voting accessible for every single person. I think everyone, when it comes to voting, should be on the same playing field, that my vote matters just as much as yours, Alex, and so on. So I hope one day we'll all be able to safely and at least somewhat easily cast our vote. So.
Yeah, I mean, as technology gets better and better, it'd be awesome just to do it from your phone.
That would be incredible.
I don't know the security behind that. I'm not very tech savvy, as we can see today. But yeah, I'd love to do it from the office here.
Yeah, me too. And I really appreciate you having me and getting to kind of talk about some of Secretary Merrill's comments and about the voting process, and from a disability rights activist standpoint. So I do appreciate that.
Well, we appreciate you, and I appreciate you, Maia, for being here and explaining some of the things, you know, from the People First versus Merrill, and some of the comments that were on Monday that needed clarification. So thank you very much.
Thank you.